And a warm welcome to everybody today. I'm Janice Goldstraw-White, one of Martin Gill's colleagues at Perpetuity, and I'll be chairing today's session. And today's our first Thought Leadership webinar of 2022. And in fact, it's our 149th in total. And today's topic, as we know, is the role of auditors in tackling fraud. How can we get the best from our individual teams? We've been here every week since the beginning of lockdown, usually at this time on a Thursday afternoon, examining a topic of central interest to the prevention of crime. And the idea of these thought leadership webinars is that we critique today in order to get a better type of prevention for tomorrow. Our intention is not to try and solve everything of the world's issues in one session. More, we're trying to encourage new thinking and ideas, to debate what's going on and to put forward different perspectives for change. And a copy of this webinar will be put on our website so it can be referred to in the future. And many people, as we know, watch this after the session has actually finished. As we all know, there's long been debates about what the role of auditors should be in relation to tackling fraud. And recent reviews in this area have revealed a real gap between the expectations of audit performance and the actual reality. Current guidance is that auditors should take more of a holistic approach towards fraud. However, auditors cannot do this on their own. They need to carry out such duties in partnership with a much wider audience, including boards, management, audit committees, standard setters and regulators. But not all auditors feel that they have this support from the various bodies. Therefore, in this webinar, we're going to discuss the roles both of internal and external auditors and what they undertake in tackling fraud, how both sets of auditors can work better together, and how we can improve partnership working with other stakeholders for a more holistic approach to tackling fraud. And so today we're going to hear from three experts, all who have immense experience in this area, both from internal and external audit perspective, and those working on the ground with both audit and fraud teams. We therefore look forward to what they're going to tell us about how to get the best from your auditors in relation to tackling fraud. So without further ado, what I'm going to do in a second is to invite our individual panel members to introduce themselves. And once they've done that, I'll ask them in the same order to make their opening statements. That's about 3 minutes where they get to say whatever they want to on this topic. And after that, we'll open up the floor. We'll ask you, the audience, to ask your questions. So can I encourage you all to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Please try and get your questions in early, and we'll endeavour to include as many as we can during this discussion. So without any further delay, let's go and meet our panel. Let's go first to Liz. Liz, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Janice, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. So I'm Liz Sandwith, and I'm the Chief Professional Practice Advisor at the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, UK and Ireland. And that means I'm responsible for advising and representing the Institute on all matters relating to the professional practice of internal audit. I am a non-exec director for a housing association and chair of their Audit and Risk Committee, and an independent board member. And I've been an internal audit professional for 33 years, working in the public sector, the private sector, and in the financial services sector as well. I'm also a member of our IIA Global Standards Board, which means that I am able to influence the IIA standards, whether or not they're fit for purpose in the current climate, and whether we need to amend them. And we are going through a major review and overhaul of the standards. And I was also awarded, I'm very proud to be awarded, the J.J. Morris Award in 2020 for distinguished service to the profession. So that's who I am.
Thank you very much, Liz. And now we'll move over to Gareth. Gareth, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks very much, Janice. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thanks for the opportunity to join your seminar this afternoon. My name's Gareth Mills, so I'm an engagement lead, an audit director with Grant Thornton. I'm in my 20th year now, working in public sector external audit. So my role is to lead a number of external audits across the local authority and NHS sectors. working with a variety of organisations, large teaching hospitals, clinical commissioning groups, mental health trusts on the NHS side, and then in terms of local authorities, I audit very large sort of metropolitan councils, smaller district ones, and even sort of national park authorities in some instances. So quite a lot of experience in the external audit market over the last 20 years or so, and looking forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth. And now we'll go over to Rob. Rob, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Janice. And as Gareth and Liz have said, thank you for the opportunity. So I'm the Head of Internal Audit, Anti-Fraud and Assurance for Barnsley Council, and indeed one of Gareth's client organisations. I'm also the Council's Statutory Data Protection Officer. I've been a SIPFA member for 31 years and I'm in my 38th year in the public sector. So cut me and I bleed the public sector. I've been the Head of Internal Audit at Barnsley for 23 years, managing a solely in-house team. And in that time, client organisations have obviously been the local council, but police, fire, pensions, FE College, Transport Executive, City Region, and housing. And in those 23 years, I've had an anti-fraud function within the, under my jurisdiction. And more recently, I've also been a non-exec director in a primary care organisation. Look forward to the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much, panel, for introducing yourselves. I certainly think we've got a wealth of experience today and different backgrounds as well, so I look forward to the ensuing discussions after individual statements. Right, I'm going to go back in the same order that everybody introduced themselves. So Liz, I'm going to you first. Can I have your opening statement, please, Liz?
Thank you very much. Yes. The threat of fraud, I think, is one of the most common challenges to governance that organisations face, without regard to size, industry, location or sector. Fraud, without question, is on the increase globally, and it is so devastating that it can bring organisations completely to their knees, as we saw with Patisserie Valerie and also with the Wirecard 1.9 billion fraud. It is estimated, according to the Cabinet Office, to cost the taxpayer between 29.3 billion and 51.8 billion annually. So it is a hot topic, and has certainly over the last probably 20 months, I would say, really started to ratchet up in terms of its significance to organisations, and therefore the fact that it's much more on the radar of internal auditors in organisations. I think that's partly because of the link between fraud and cybercrime, which links to remote working, and the challenges that remote working presents to organisations and individuals in terms of the ability to, behave appropriately, not click on that email that you shouldn't have clicked on, that then highlights risks to your organisation. From an internal audit perspective, as I'm sure you will all be aware, our role is around risk management, internal control and governance. And when we look at risk, one of the things that we need to be focused on is fraud risk. And internal audit functions need to undertake a fraud risk assessment, understand where fraud is most likely to be prevalent in their organisations, and then to remember that and to focus not on identifying fraud, but on making sure that you have got great preventative, detective and directive controls in place in those areas in the business where fraud runs the risk of being more high profile, if you like, or a greater risk. I think the other thing that's really important, and I talk quite a lot to internal auditors and members of the Institute about, is the fraud triangle, if you like. So, can an individual, has an individual rather a need? Are they financially strapped? Can they justify it? So things like organisation going through redundancies, or mergers, acquisitions, those sorts of things that makes the individual think their job is at risk? And do they have an opportunity? So at the moment, you know, with the COVID, we've got lots and lots of organisations where a significant proportion of staff are absent from work because they're not well. Therefore, does that present an opportunity? Because perhaps you've got different people authorising things, perhaps people aren't as thorough as they were in the past or have been previously. So internal audit needs to think about the triangle, needs to undertake its fraud risk assessment and be mindful of the appropriate controls to mitigate the risk of fraud within the organisation or in the area they're auditing. However, it is not internal audit's responsibility to find fraud. It is internal audit's responsibility to ensure that management puts the appropriate controls in place that mitigate the risk of fraud and whether those controls are fit for purpose. But I do believe that there is more that internal audit can do in this space. And I'm not talking about detecting, I'm talking about improving and strengthening control, and also working with colleagues like Gareth as our external auditors, so that we're neither duplicating nor having gaps in terms of areas that we're all looking at, to ensure that collaboratively we will identify areas of potentially high fraud risk. So that's my opening statement, Janice.
Thank you very much, Liz. That's very interesting. I'm sure there's lots of areas we'll be coming back to later there. Okay, if I now may, I'll go over to Gareth. Gareth, if we can have your opening statement, please.
Yes, thanks, Janet, and very interesting listening to Liz's session there. You mentioned earlier, Janice, around the expectations gap, and I think that's probably a good place to kick off, I guess, my element of the discussion in terms of, you know, when things go wrong in an organisation, one of the first questions people ask is, where were the external auditors? What were the external auditors doing? And I think there is a general understanding or expectation that the external auditors are there to, you know, prevent and detect fraud in terms of their external audit work. And you know, it's actually the, you know, ultimately the responsibility of the organisation in question to put in place those requirements and procedures. I should also say, as I mentioned in my introduction, that my sort of experience and background is public sector. So, you know, as Liz mentioned, there are some high profile activities that have happened in the commercial sector in recent years, which have been of a fraudulent nature. But I suppose my working life is spent in the public sector, and I guess frauds on a significant scale have not been as many. So I guess in terms of setting out what the external auditor's role in public sector external audits is ultimately one of the key requirements of our work is that we need to ensure that the accounts are free from material misstatement, be that in terms of fraud or error. We need to have a reasonable level of assurance over that in order to issue a clean audit opinion. So that inclusion of the word material is quite significant here. So something's material if its omission from the accounts would impact on the users of the accounts. Now, in the organisations that I audit, materiality is typically quite a significant figure. So if you take Barnsley Council, for example, that obviously Rob and I are familiar with, materiality on that audit is over £8 million. So it gives you, I suppose, a bit of context there in terms of where external auditors are coming to. So we don't give ultimate absolute assurance over the accounts, auditing things to the penny. It's fair to say public sector audits are taking long enough at the moment without auditing them to the penny. So it is a reasonable level of assurance that's the actual requirement for external audit, that the accounts are free from material misstatement due to fraud or error. And it's also worth emphasising that even a well-run audit that's compliant with all the auditing and accounting standards may not detect all those areas of fraud and error. In my experience in the public sector, there are elements of fraud that I come across, but these typically are non-material in nature. So they're absolutely key in terms of being highlighted to strengthen existing controls and governance, and they're rightly discussed at audit committee forums, but they're not typically of a material nature that impacts on the audit opinion of an external auditor. Particularly in local authorities, there are a small number of instances where in the NHS where there are, shall we say, more challenges to deliver a certain financial position in the NHS to feed into that sort of Department of Health overall model, where certain trusts have effectively manipulated their financial performance for a period of time, and that ultimately that has come to light, and that has led to material errors in terms of fraudulent presentation. But my experience is typically are not that material in nature. In terms of how we go about demonstrating our duties as external auditors to identify potential areas of material misstatement, we would typically meet regularly with management. We'd review relevant board papers, council papers. We'd meet with the likes of Rob as head of internal audit to check on his work in terms of anything of a fraud nature. And one of the key areas where external auditors have really started to focus in recent years, under some pressure from the FRC as our sort of financial regulator, is areas where the accounts could be manipulated in terms of estimate and judgment by management, and in terms of areas where management may seek to circumvent the existing controls in place, and that's typically through the use of journals in terms of financial reporting. So one of the key areas where external auditors have really been focusing in recent years is the detailed testing of a significant proportion of journals. And as you can imagine, in a council or an NHS organisation, that's quite a significant number of items. So there's a risk assessment process that goes through looking at potentially high risk journals to make sure that external audit can understand them, and to ensure that we've done sufficient and appropriate audit testing to give ourselves that best opportunity, that reasonable level of assurance of identifying any material areas of fraud or error. Thank you, Janice.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth. That's interesting to see what you've got to say on the external audit side. We've got a few questions in already, but can I just remind you, if you want to ask any questions, please use the question and answer button, get these questions in early, and I'll try and address as many as I can before the end of the session. And now we'll move over to Rob. Rob, can I have your opening statement, please?
Thanks, Janice. Yeah, coming from my perspective as a sort of very practical point of view, having had an internal audit and an anti-fraud function in my responsibility for a couple of decades. So for me, I see internal audit as just being fundamentally part of the anti-fraud measures in an organisation. Yes, there are certain technical skills required if you are going to detect and investigate, but I don't see internal controls relate to fraud risk as any different to any other aspects of internal controls, risk or governance. So that's very much my sort of perspective from a very practical view. I think for me, regardless of organisation, there needs to be a very secure strategic recognition of fraud risk. Organisations or managers saying, oh, it can't possibly happen here or on my watch. I think auditors need to challenge that where they come across that type of resistance. It's stating the bleeding obvious, but it's people that are the weakness in relation to fraud, whether that's clearly it's individuals who perpetrate fraud, but it's also individuals within the organisation that present opportunities for others. And if time allows, there is a very a working example of that me and Gareth have lived and breathed with for a number of months last year. For me, I think any organisation can undertake facilitated fraud risk assessments. Clearly, internal auditors are very skilled at facilitating that. So it's asking the right questions and challenging that reaction that we quite often get that, oh, well, that couldn't possibly happen, sort of here. And for me, from a practical point of view, all pieces of internal audit work that we scope are run by my principal auditor who looks after the corporate anti-fraud team. So every piece of audit work has an anti-fraud perspective potentially layered into it. So whilst auditors are skilled and experienced, there's another layer of expertise that's layered on to each piece of work to potentially identify any sort of fraud risk vulnerabilities. I think if you are internal in a in-house team where you can live and feel and breathe an organisation, I think that helps to get the general sense of culture and the appetite to address and embrace fraud risk. And I say that because I've seen, and I'm sure Liz and Gareth has, quite marked differences in the engagement of internal audit if you are a bought-in service or a semi-outsourced one, different to an in-house one. Whereas I say you are living and breathing the organisation, or involved in contact with senior managers in a far more day-to-day basis. So I think an internal audit team like mine has a sort of I suppose a head start in feeling and understanding fraud risk and being able to contribute to that perhaps more than others. And Gareth touched on it. My final point is really around audit committees. And every organisation of any decent size either has to have one or should have one. So if they're not asking questions about fraud risk and looking in the eyes of management about this, but also asking the head of internal audit about their response to fraud risk, then I don't think they're doing their job properly either. So I'll leave it there, but I think from my perspective, it's a very practical, perspective on things. So hopefully I can share some of my experiences in due course.
Okay, thank you very much then, Rob. I've got a number of questions in, so we'll get started on these as soon as possible. If I can come to you first, perhaps, Liz, just a very short sort of answer is, to one of the questions we've had, and it's something that I hear raised a lot of the time, is why should we have internal audit at all? My chief execs, you say you don't find fraud, so how do I sell it to my chief exec that we need internal audit?
Well, as I said, and Rob has also said, it's not our specific job to find fraud, but what we are exceptionally good at is ensuring that the controls that management have put in place, the policies and procedures that management have created, are being adhered to and are fit for purpose. So the number of times that, internal audit will comment on a control being in the wrong place in a process, or not being strong enough, or not being adhered to, there are vast numbers. And I think, therefore, what internal audit does is provide the audit committee, senior management, with an assurance that the controls that are in place, that are there to prevent or detect fraud, actually are fit for purpose. So we can provide a bit, as Gareth said, because absolute assurance is never a possibility, but we can provide a reasonable assurance that the controls that management have put in place are effectively designed and operating effectively. Okay,
thank you, Liz. If I could come to you now, Rob, we've had, I'm trying to combine some of the questions because we've had so many. One of the questions, it relates to whether who's actually looking at the risk assessments that individual auditors are actually coming up with. So who's checking the auditors in terms of risk assessment, that they're actually looking at the right things?
Yeah, there's always a question of who audits the auditors.
Indeed.
Well, putting that to one side, because that's a whole different webinar. I think the perspective, and it almost links to the first question about culture. And if an organisation is serious about improving and being accountable, whether it's in the public sector, obviously to the public, but the shareholders or other stakeholders, I think it shines a light on the potential culture of an organisation if there are some way resistant to internal audit in the first place, or not open enough to have a robust risk assessment process that have the capacity and the willingness to look very closely at themselves. And I suppose I'd have a slightly different view on risk management as well, in terms of, rather than looking at the negative, what could go wrong, failure to do this, failure to do that, is spin it and look at the positive. What assurances do you need to know that you're doing everything in the right way that ensures success, ensures delivery, ensures that you don't have things? Some of it's semantics, but if organisations can look and reflect on that positive enabling perspective on risk, and fraud covers all aspects of risk, it can be very powerful to have a very different, more open conversation where you are talking about the success factors for delivery rather than the negative perspectives of, oh, woe is me, it could all go horribly wrong and there could be disasters. Well, actually, we're not planning for disasters, we're planning for success, we're planning for delivery, we're planning to avoid problems. So I think there's a whole discussion about the quality of risk assessments, but they have to be challenged by internal audit. I think if management's responsibility to identify risks and the mitigations, then there has to be a very clear role for internal audit to individually assess the obviously strategic risks, but annually be satisfied that the whole risk management arrangements in place in an organisation are sufficiently robust and adequate. Otherwise, we can hardly do risk-based internal auditing. We can't rely on the risk assessments and risk management process in the organisation.
And we talk about risk-based auditing though, but when you're actually drawing up your sort of annual audit plan, how much do you actually take into consideration the actual overall objectives of the organisation?
Completely.
You're looking at achieving, not setting out to fail, but we're looking at to ensure that you can achieve those objectives.
Entirely. I mean, internal audit by its very definition is to assist an organisation achieve organisational value and improvement. So it obviously has to be geared to strategic and operational objectives. But I think there's a certainly how I adopt it in the council is very much a facilitated discussion about that. So it's and the whole purpose of this webinar, I guess, is how internal auditors need to work with other parts of organisations, not just for the whole aspect of controls, risk and governance. And I do feel, and I've seen this in other colleagues, that there is that resistance. So I think I'd appeal to internal auditors out there to just muscle in. I think it's really important to ensure that you are in the right places. The whole remit of internal auditors should have unfettered access to people and information. Whilst we don't want to wave our warrant cards around too often, we have them for a purpose. So it again comes back to the culture of an organisation about how willing they are to embrace internal challenge and support. Bearing in mind it is internal auditors don't run off to the Daily Mirror or anywhere else to have hang the dirty washing out. So it should be viewed as a very, very strong management tool for improvement.
Just to add to that, if I may, Janice, if that's possible. I mean, one of the things I often do in my audit committees, both NHS and local government, is you know, when we're discussing the internal audit plan or the board assurance framework or the corporate risk register, is really to challenge the non-auditors sat around that table, i.e. management or non-exec directors or elected members. You know, are these the areas that are keeping you awake at night? Are these the key, you know, is internal audit and counter fraud focusing there? Obviously finite resources and all that, are they focusing on the areas that really mean the most to this local authority or NHS organisation? And I think, you know, anybody who sits on an audit committee or a board, that's something I think that's good to keep thinking about and reminding yourselves that, you know, is this assurance work or counter fraud work focusing on the key areas from your perspective?
And do you find that audit committees and boards are challenging in this way, aren't they?
The ones I work with, I'd say in the main, absolutely, that you know, the non-exec directors or elected members in local authority, you know, do challenge the likes of Rob when he brings a draft plan to committee, and it's clear, you know, Rob and other heads of internal audit do take on board the views of senior management and elected members, non-exec directors, when constructing that audit plan to make sure that the finite resources of internal audit or counter fraud are, you know, being focused on the right area. But I just think it's something that's got to be sort of living and breathing throughout the year. And if things change, you know, those plans or those areas of directed work, you know, need to change accordingly. And I think, you know, the stronger audit committees, and I'd say, you know, the vast majority of my clients, I think that the committee do challenge, you know, the work being performed in an appropriate manner, and do get that opportunity to input into where those resources are focused. And I think that's, you know, for anybody on this session this afternoon that sits on a committee or a board, that's a good sort of self-challenge to think about at each meeting. You know, are we talking about the right things?
It is not, I think in some way, it's knowing the questions to ask. Some of the board members are actually reluctant to ask questions or ask the obvious questions, which I personally always think are the best questions.
Absolutely, Jen. I know, I totally agree with that.
Everybody's always forgotten that. But I think in some way we've got some sort of responsibility for sort of educating the board and bringing them on board to give them the confidence at least to ask those questions, because we know that having the culture, they're setting the tone at the top, and having the right culture within the organisation is so important. We can move on now to sorry, Liz, you want to just say something else?
Yes, I did. Building on what Rob and Gareth has just said, and then you mentioned the word culture, and I think that the culture of an organisation in relation to fraud is very important. I am aware through, you know, years of working for different organisations where, you know, fraud was a bit of a don't tell anyone, and people just disappeared when they'd been found to have committed fraud, and there was no learning from it. So whilst I'm not suggesting you know, you blow the trumpets and bang the drums, I do think that, you know, if you have a fraud in your organisation, then it is a massive opportunity for internal audit as well as senior management and the audit committee to learn some lessons from that. How did it happen? Why did it happen? How was it identified is another particular one. So when I worked in the private sector and we used to have a fraud team, you know, internal audit and the fraud team used to meet regularly. So if they identified a fraud, they would tell us, and then we could look at the controls in place that failed to allow that to happen. Equally, if we found poor control, we'd alert the fraud team so they could start perhaps looking out for something as a result of very weak or poor controls. So I think you were right at the beginning. This isn't internal audit, external audit. It is about working collaboratively across your organisation to ensure that you have a risk around fraud clearly identified, and as I said earlier, that the appropriate controls in place that we regularly monitor.
I think that leads nicely into the next set of questions I was going to ask, really, was, well, we're all signed up to the fact that we all want to work together, internal audit, external audit, individual organisations. So really, what's actually stopping us? What are the barriers? You know, what can we do, if anything, about this? Rob, can I come to you first on that, please? Or aren't you finding any barriers?
Well, I'm hesitating because I suppose it's a feature of me having been head of internal audit for 23 years that I've beaten all the barriers down over time. So it without putting too much of a burden on heads of internal auditors out there, it's your role to be to knocking them down. And it comes back to the point we've all mentioned about culture and the appetite of an organisation to learn and grow and improve. I can see why there are barriers, and it's that issue of embarrassment if something happens. But I'm struggling to think of any sector or any organisation that doesn't have stakeholders who they are accountable to, and therefore have an obligation to demonstrate that they are taking all reasonable measures to secure good, effective internal controls, risk and governance, including anti-fraud measures. And as I say, it doesn't have to be, put on the front pages of the local newspapers, but it has to be an opportunity. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. If something bad happens, which inevitably it does and will, then you've got to learn from it. So I think, as I say, without putting too much onus on heads of audit, I do feel very strongly that that's the role that goes with that job title, is to push and push and push.
Yes, Liz?
I was just going to say, I think it's not just about pushing, which I absolutely agree with, but I think there is an opportunity for internal audit to be more flexible in what it does. And, things like providing real-time assurance. So there's been a bit in the press recently about the bounce back loans that government put in place, the furlough schemes, and the CEO of HMRC has mentioned before Christmas that he reckons that there was 4.6 billion of inappropriate claims for furlough out of 47 billion they paid out, which is 10%. So, where your organisation is submitting claims for that, where your organisation is creating a new initiative, why is internal audit not more to be found as the process is being developed, providing that real-time assurance? No, that control won't work. You need to tighten that control. Have you thought? Rather than, the old adage, coming along after the battle and bayoneting the wounded. We need to be rolling our sleeves up and working with our organisation to prevent these things happening, because we are there at the cutting edge when new initiatives are being devised.
And you can guarantee the fraudsters are miles ahead of this. Can I come to you, Gareth? You were talking earlier about the fact that you review as external auditors, journals in a slightly different way than maybe you have. I wanted to just sort of touch on the subject. We haven't got time to go into too much detail about the use of data analytics in actual risk assessing. And obviously that is one area where you've had a look at it to actually employ that. Do you want to expand any more on that, please?
Yes, it's a good question. I did notice that one in the list. Yes, I mean, journals, because they have the opportunity for, as I say, management to override controls, that the management override of controls is what's deemed a significant audit risk across all external audits, regardless of their sector, trying to reflect, I guess, the potential seriousness of what could happen in that particular arena. So in the work that I do in the NHS and local government, as I mentioned earlier, that these are quite significant organisations that will typically have a large number of journals throughout the financial year, and we do use quite sophisticated technology that can download sort of all the journals processed in the year, and then it can analyse them based on risk. So we can highlight, a number of my local authorities have got particular challenges around dealing with deficits on their dedicated school grant. So we can look at journals that are particular around that and the potential for that particular financial position to be manipulated. We can look at ones done on bank holidays or weekends or out of normal hours. We could look at ones posted by more senior members of a finance function, so the FD, the deputy FD, at that type of higher level where they're potentially not posting that many. So what are they doing? There's an ability to sort of slice and dice quite a lot of information through using those data analytical tools to generate a sort of risk assessed population to really focus our audit work on. So typically on an organisation like the size of Barnsley, our number of journals that we might look at are typically probably around the sort of 80 to 100 number, but we'll audit them in quite a number of detail, because those particular journals that are in that sample, they will have ticked quite a lot of the potential higher risk boxes through the the data analytics, and that's therefore we've focused our audit work on that. And I think in terms of GT's most recent FRC reviews on public sector files, they were the FRC, the regulator, were pleased in terms of how we'd gone about sort of testing for management overrider controls in terms of some of the work we've done around journals and the sort of challenge around other areas of estimate and judgment. And I think there's another question around professionals keeping skeptical and all that, and that's all very much part of that similar approach to sort of focusing on where could the accounts be materially misstated, as I say, either through error or fraud. And obviously fraud is more difficult to identify than error, because you're talking about potential collusion, forgery, things like that. It is more difficult, but nevertheless, those sort of data analytics do try to highlight any areas that would be within the accounts.
Okay, thank you. If I could just come to each of you for 30 seconds for you to sort of sum up to say what one thing would you like to be able to change in your area that would actually make a significant difference to what we got from our individual audit teams, etc. If I could come to you first, Liz.
I would like to see more internal audit teams doing real-time assurance, not waiting, putting audits in the plan, picking them up 6, 8, 10 months down the track, but new initiatives, new products, new changes to policies and procedures. Internal audit, get stuck in, have a look at it and provide feedback to the organisation if you don't think it's strong enough to mitigate the risk of fraud occurring in your organisation.
Okay, thanks. Very interesting. Rob, any comments?
The one thing I'd like to see is that every senior management team or CEO has a session at least once a year on fraud risk, and that the head of internal audit is present there to facilitate a discussion that demonstrates the culture's right to accept and acknowledge fraud risk is there and what they're going to do about it.
Okay, thank you, Rob. And Gareth, finally?
Yeah, I think a lot of the work around sort of fraud and error, I think auditors have come a long way in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of dealing with potential management overrider controls that could lead to that. I think the audit work is a lot more granular and detailed than it was. But I think coming back to that expectations gap, there was a really interesting point raised in the Q&A around the sort of impact of materiality, and that would be helpful to stakeholders. And there used to be a very small proportion of public sector audit opinions that did actually include the materiality level in the opinion, and that was in NHS Foundations Trust, and that's gone now. So I think there is an opportunity, to include it in the actual opinion to make it clear in terms of where auditors' sort of materiality levels are at. I think that would be helpful for readers of the accounts to understand.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's been a very interesting discussion. We had a lot of questions in today, so I'm very sorry if we didn't get to your individual question. I'll try to combine a few. I think we've seen how we are moving forward as individual internal auditors, external auditors, and working together more, looking more to risk-based approach and having more real time and using data analytics. I actually feel for once we're actually starting to move forward on this, but obviously we have to keep this continuation going, because fraudsters will certainly be going as equally as fast, if not faster than us. So thank you to all the panellists for their contribution. Just before we go, we've got a few notices here now in terms of our individual events. Call for nominations for the security OSPAs in Ireland. That's ending on the 10th of January. The New Zealand OSPAs are closing on the 14th of January. For those of you attending today, obviously from an economic crime background, you're pleased to know that the TECAs are opening on the 28th of March, so please check that out and get your nominations in. And also the Worldwide Cyber OSPAs on the 11th of April, they'll be opening then, so please get your entries in there. And this time next, oh, and sorry, yes, we'll book your place, our first real life event, hopefully on the 24th of February, the UK OSPAs taking place in London, so book your place for that. And we'll be doing all this again next week and on a Thursday as normal, where the issue will be talking about diversity. What about the disabled and LGBT community? Spent a lot of time concentrating on whether putting more women into security positions, etc. But we've probably neglected the area of disability and LGBT. So we want to address those gaps in next week's webinar. And you can see there's one afterwards on protecting public and legal obligations. And then just make a note on 28th that it will be changing to a Friday, looking at young security professionals. So it leaves me once again just to thank the panellists again for their contributions. It's been a very good session today. Can I thank you, the audience, for taking part and all your questions that you've put forward, and also to Christine and Sarah in the background technically helping me run this session. As we always say, thank you for attending, and wherever you are in the world, please stay safe. We look forward to meeting you again.